the off case where you are unable to establish a sense of rapport with your interviewee, this will most likely affect the quality of the data. So how would you proceed in this type of a situation?
Yeah, and that probably will happen, especially when you first start out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you just get better at it. But you're right. I mean, you're going to have some data that may be a bit stilted. I think the data still becomes good. It's really hard to assess the quality of the data. What you can do to kind of improve upon this is after your first interview, take a look at that interview and see what's going on, and then maybe bring someone else in, a supervisor or just another look, and say, what could I have done there maybe to increase rapport? And I think if you're present with the person, that helps a lot. You know, you're engaged and you're listening and being prepared to. So it's more of trying to avoid it, having the sort of follow-up questions. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it it's really hard. I've had those kinds of interviews more often than I'd like to to admit, but it's that happens, and you do your best to get the answers you can, but that's legitimate. That's as much as the person wants to share, and the
Mm-hmm.
only thing you can do is to try to improve that sense of rapport. And I think you talked a bit about in your video about just the atmosphere and
Just
maybe
making sure that they're as comfortable as they can be
right. I mean,
within the setting.
if it's virtual like this, well, that's a little harder, but
Mm-hmm.
whatever, getting them a coffee, maybe having some cookies, just something that sort of relaxes things
Mm-hmm.
a little bit, makes it feel informal.
Key issues with interviews is asking the right questions. Pilot studies are a great way to test out your questions. As a researcher, what would you do if your questions went over great in the pilot study but flopped in the research study? Would you and rewrite your questions and re-record the interviews, or could you potentially use the data that was collected during the pilot study and use that towards the write-up of your research study?
Yeah, I mean that could happen. So again, I try to avoid the way I try to avoid that happening would be pilot testing with like at least two or three people, and people that I know would be sort of critical, and I'd ask them to be critical of the questions. How'd that question sound to you? Was that something? And they say, well, I didn't, maybe felt like a closed question, or it felt like, and then
Mm-hmm.
you say when, and so there's that. But again, that, you do all that thing and it still doesn't go over well, some of the questions. I doubt that all of them would flop. So I think you could use the data and it wouldn't come to a halt. You would just get probably answers that may not be particularly insightful or in depth. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and that might happen with any question. So that you still could use probably some of the data. I think you would probably want to reflect a bit about whether you had to do that, rewrite their questions. You can't re-record the interviews because people will not give you that kind of time, and but you could consider modifying some of your questions, tweaking them, but do it gently. You don't want to change it all based on one person because might be some one quirky sort of person.
If that's the case, then I guess just as an add-on in terms of reliability regarding the questions, if you tweak the question and say you have an interview the day of, the questions don't go well, you tweak them that night, and then you have an interview the next day, how does that affect, I guess, the way that you analyze the data? Because technically the questions are not
Mhm.
exactly the same.
Yeah, that's true. I guess it depends on the number of interviews you do. I think if you're open about it in in your results in terms of the procedure and you talk a bit about that, there was some slight modification of wording.
Mm-hmm.
But you can, more often than not, you can avoid this if you do piling with enough people. And so what you're emphasizing here is saying, what happens if this happens? Well, that really the good answer there or the clear answer is there, make sure it doesn't happen. And you can do a lot in that way if you really, because people are anxious to interview, right? Take step back, make sure the questions check with others. The thing is, you think
Hmm.
things are crystal clear. Even, as a teacher, you think, oh, this is clear, but it may not be. And but you can adapt in an interview too. You talked about reliability, but you can have a question, but maybe you have to rephrase it. Doesn't mean it just means that you had to, with that individual, kind of help them understand what you meant because maybe they didn't have the prerequisite knowledge done it. So you had to explain a little bit.
Hmm.
It's essentially the same question you're asking, but you've had to help them a bit understand.
Slightly modify it.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the beauty of qualitative research. It's organic to a certain extent. So it's not going to be as this sort of precise question. Don't deviate like an interview at a
Mhm.
job or something like that.
The literature reveals that as researchers, we need to be ethically sound in terms of the questions that we ask our participants, other than the norm, for example, weight, age, salary. What kinds of questions are too personal or ethically unsound to ask, and does this depend on the nature of the research study?
Yeah, I think there's a relatively short answer to that. I I Ethics is determined by the Research Ethics Board, and they'll tell you if you're going over the line or what they. And so it absolutely all depends on the nature of your research study. I mean, if you're looking at attitudes towards laptops, that's quite a bit different than talking to individuals who have AIDS or whatever.
Mhm.
That's pretty personal stuff, but if you have some research questions that delve into some really meaningful, deep stuff, well, in a certain context, that's okay because what you do is you tell the participant ahead of time in the form is these are the kinds of things that we're going to ask. This is what they here that's when they sign a consent form so that they're fully informed before they go in. And with ethical, the way it works is even if they're in the middle of it or even at the beginning, they get uneasy, they don't want to do it. They say, I'm totally uncomfortable with this. All ethical reviews allow them to back out. So there's a lot of
Mhm.
checks and balances in the ethical review process. So I think you need to look at what your research is, what are the key questions that you're asking, and then have your interview questions match those, and then you can check with others, but you can't second guess ethics. They'll let you know.
So the setting in which the interview data is collected is of the utmost importance. It can put the participant at ease and dictate the course of the interview. For example, if the participant is uncomfortable, this can affect the quality of his or her answers and their willingness to share personal information, thoughts, and feelings. So, what is the best way to go about selecting your interview location?
Yeah. It's not something I actually have put a lot of thought into, so I'd probably be winging it a bit. I can understand this, but some people, people have feel comfortable in different settings, right? So it's not always easy
Mhm.
to guess that. But usually, I mean, ideally, or wonderful quiet library or whatever room where you can, so you try to with great lighting and that kind of thing. So I don't know if there's any ideal setting. Probably one that you feel comfortable with, one that you're unlikely to be disturbed from. A lot of interviews could be done, in my perspective now, online. So then that becomes they're completely comfortable in their homes. That's another angle to look at it. And honestly, I would encourage MA students, depending on their study, of course, right? It's almost better to see if you can interview people, and if it's an educational setting, to interview them in their setting. Make it convenient for them. I'll come down and they can find so that it's their home, their place. You probably won't be in their home, but they'll be their
Mhm.
school or something like that. So you try to make it as convenient for them as possible, and then if you can do it online, well, that's really convenient. I mean, I'm really comfortable in my home. I don't feel, any stress here. So above all, as a master's student, you want to make it convenient and you want to get your data.
Although individual interviews can provide in-depth information, which allows the researcher to investigate social and personal matters in an in-depth manner, the actual data analysis and transcription of the data can be time-consuming. Do you have any tips or techniques about how to move the process along without losing the value or the richness of the data?
This is qualitative research, and I don't think you really need not to be in a hurry to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually one of it's a lot of fun to look at the data. I know it sounds weird looking,
Mm-hmm.
but when you're actually listening to the answers, like when you're doing the interview, you're there, you're present, but you are listening, but it's different than looking at it afterwards and going, oh, they're saying this and they're saying, like, you notice it, and they're not
Mm-hmm.
there and you're not nervous and it's all. So I suggest to try to get into depth. It will take a lot of time for sure. The transcription will take some time, and then the analysis. There's different software tools to help you. In general, I do a scan of the data to try to find themes if I haven't determined them ahead of time through a literature review. And then I start to try to categorize the statements. And then you
Mm-hmm.
start to get your themes. And if you're feeling comfortable with it and it seems to like you can, maybe I would do a little bit from one, a little bit from another, a little bit from another, just to make sure that these codes are working. And then I can adjust them. I'd also have a little table on the side to articulate why I'm giving these codes so that I know why. Because sometimes tuition and then all of a sudden it gets messy because you think, oh, and once you have your themes, then it becomes easier because then, you can code and then sort it and then you have examples. So I would actually encourage people to go slowly, particularly slowly at first. Develop a table to articulate why they're coding the way they're coding. So that can be a way to do it. Like that can be their guide,
Mm-hmm.
right or wrong. Like it may not be the best guide, but it's the one you use. So you're making yourself transparent because you have to be you try to be transparent about this. And you try to get the data as rich as possible, finding rich examples. That's the whole point. Well, just say one interview that could be up to 10, 15 hours on that
Mm-hmm.
easily, in terms of adding it, just you transcribe it, that's a number of hours. You have to read it, you have to code it. It could be easily 10, 15, could be 20 hours, depending on how long your interview is.
Mm-hmm.
Which sounds like a lot, but you have to be prepared for it.